We don't need them to make our cars, and they make a lot of them.
It turns out about 10% of the cars that we buy here in the U.S. are made in Canada, which is not nothing, but 225,000 vehicles a year shipped.
Business is coming back to the United States so that they don't have to pay tariffs, and I think also because of November 5th, the election.
The impact has been extreme. I mean, I'd like to put it in context here. The first Trump administration.
And that really has been killing Tesla, killing all automakers.
The migration of two of America's most iconic companies, Ford and Tesla, to Canada has sparked a dramatic shift in the landscape of the U.S. auto industry. Once seen as the heart and soul of American industrial prowess, both Ford and Tesla have made the unprecedented decision to move their production lines to Canada. For decades, the United States prided itself on its powerful manufacturing base, which fueled the American economy and symbolized the country's strength. But now, the very companies that built that image are abandoning U.S. soil and relocating to a neighboring country. Ford, known for its legendary trucks like the Super Duty, once a staple of American manufacturing, now produces these vehicles across the border in Oakville, Ontario. Meanwhile, Tesla, often regarded as the pioneer of clean energy and electric vehicles in the U.S., has shifted its production of the cutting-edge 4,680 battery to Quebec. The battery was once seen as the backbone of America's clean energy future. Yet, now it is being built in Canada, powered by cheap hydroelectric energy and backed by a staggering $1.2 billion in Canadian government incentives. This shift in production isn't just a business move, it's a seismic change in the very fabric of American industry. These two companies, once at the forefront of the U.S. economy, have now set up shop in a foreign country, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions. How did this happen? Why did Ford and Tesla decide to move? To understand why these companies left, we need to take a closer look at the policies of the Trump administration and their direct impact on American manufacturing. When Donald Trump became president, one of his central promises was to bring jobs back to America. He pushed for protectionist trade policies, most notably through the imposition of a 25% tariff on imported goods, particularly on cars and auto parts. The theory was simple. By taxing imports, American companies would be forced to buy domestically, thereby protecting U.S. jobs and reviving the manufacturing sector. On paper, this strategy seemed like a good plan to reinvigorate American factories, boost jobs, and restore the industrial backbone of the country. However, in practice, the consequences of these tariffs were far more damaging than anticipated. Far from protecting U.S. jobs, the tariffs created a significant strain on American manufacturers. While companies like Ford and Tesla were meant to benefit from the tariff system, the reality was that these tariffs turned every vehicle produced in the U.S. into an increasingly expensive product. Ford, for example, was expected to lose up to $2.5 billion by 2025, with almost $800 million of that loss coming from just one quarter of the year. For Tesla, the situation was similarly grim, with an additional $300 million in costs for the same period. This situation was unsustainable. The tariffs on foreign auto parts and materials made it far more expensive to build cars in the United States. As a result, automakers were forced to either absorb these costs, raise prices for consumers, or look for ways to cut costs elsewhere. For Ford and Tesla, the most viable solution was to relocate some of their manufacturing operations to Canada, where production costs were significantly lower. In Canada, these companies could avoid the harsh tariffs imposed by the U.S. government, take advantage of abundant and inexpensive hydroelectric energy, and benefit from tax incentives and government subsidies designed to attract foreign investment. This isn't just about numbers or bottom lines, it's about the collapse of an industry that was once the backbone of America's industrial might. American manufacturing, which had for decades provided millions of jobs and fueled the nation's economy, was being hollowed out by a series of ill-conceived trade policies. As companies like Ford and Tesla packed up and moved north, American workers were left behind to face a rapidly shrinking job market and rising unemployment. Communities that had once relied on the steady hum of factory floors and assembly lines were now left with empty buildings and uncertain futures. For the workers who were left behind, the reality was even more devastating. Thousands of jobs were lost as factories in Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana closed their doors. In many of these towns, factories had been the lifeblood of the local economy for generations. The workers who had spent decades building cars and parts for these companies were now out of work, facing a bleak future with limited job opportunities. And it wasn't just the workers who were affected. Entire communities were thrown into turmoil as local economies that had once thrived on manufacturing jobs began to unravel. Retail businesses, service industries, and even housing markets were hit hard as people packed up and left in search of new opportunities. The immediate effects of these factory closures were felt by thousands of American workers, but the long-term consequences were even more profound. As these companies moved to Canada, the American dream of upward mobility through hard work and manufacturing jobs seemed increasingly out of reach. The concept of "Made in America," once a symbol of pride and strength, was becoming harder to believe in. What was once a mark of quality and reliability now seemed like an unattainable goal for many middle-class families who had seen the price of cars and consumer goods skyrocket. For consumers, the impact was just as devastating. The costs of cars and trucks began to rise as tariffs drove up the price of parts and materials. Analysts predicted that the average price of a U.S. made car would increase by over $4,700 due to the tariffs. For many middle-class families, this made buying a new car an impossibility. What had once been a relatively affordable purchase was now out of reach for large portions of the American population. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the lost opportunity to participate in the consumer economy that had been a defining feature of the American middle class for generations. Politicians from both parties quickly joined the chorus of criticism against Trump's tariff policies. What had been sold as a strategy to protect American workers and bring jobs back to the U.S. was instead hollowing out the very industries it was supposed to protect. The tariffs made U.S. manufacturing too expensive, driving companies to look for cheaper alternatives elsewhere. Ford, Tesla, and other companies soon realized that they could no longer afford to produce cars in the U.S. and maintain their competitive edge in the global market. This realization led to the heartbreaking decision to move production abroad. And this wasn't just a problem for the auto industry. As the tariffs pushed Ford and Tesla to relocate their operations to Canada, other industries began to follow suit. Companies across the manufacturing sector, from food producers to electronics manufacturers, began quietly shifting their operations out of the U.S. and into Canada. Major corporations like Coca-Cola, Campbell's Soup, and Walmart found ways to reroute parts of their supply chains to Canada in order to avoid the high costs associated with tariffs. What started as a dispute over auto tariffs soon spiraled into a larger crisis that threatened the stability of the U.S. economy. In Canada, however, the story was much different. While American manufacturers struggled under the weight of tariffs, Canada was rolling out the red carpet for businesses to set up shop. In exchange for moving their operations north, Ford and Tesla received generous government incentives and subsidies. Ford was offered a $590 million deal to create 1,800 jobs in Ontario, while Tesla received an even larger $1.2 billion package to secure its 4,680 battery production in Quebec. These incentives made Canada an increasingly attractive place for U.S. companies to relocate, and as a result, more and more manufacturing jobs were being created in Canada, while American communities continued to struggle with factory closures and rising unemployment. The lure of cheaper production costs, stable energy prices, and favorable government policies made Canada the ideal destination for these companies. While U.S. workers and consumers faced rising prices and economic hardship, Canadian workers enjoyed the benefits of new job opportunities and a revitalized industrial sector. It was a cruel irony. The very policies meant to protect American workers were now contributing to the collapse of American industry, while Canada was thriving by attracting companies that had once been seen as the lifeblood of the U.S. economy. The decision by Ford and Tesla to relocate their manufacturing operations to Canada wasn't just a major shock to the auto industry, it marked the beginning of a much larger crisis. What initially seemed like a problem confined to the automotive sector began to ripple through other industries, setting off a chain reaction that would reshape the economic landscape in the United States. As Ford and Tesla moved their operations north, other companies soon followed suit, quietly shifting their supply chains and production lines to Canada, where the cost of doing business was much lower. The wave of manufacturing jobs leaving the U.S. was now undeniable. What made this shift to Canada so devastating for the United States wasn't just the loss of these companies, but the impact it had on entire communities that were built around these industries. For towns in Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana areas that had been home to Ford, Tesla, and other auto manufacturers for decades, the loss of factories was nothing short of catastrophic. These towns had built their identity around these factories. Generations of workers had clocked in day after day, building the vehicles that represented the heart of American strength and pride. But now, those factories stood silent, their gates locked, and the workers were left without jobs. It wasn't just the workers who felt the impact. Entire economies were built around these plants, and with the factories closed, the local economies began to unravel. The businesses that once thrived in the shadow of these plants, local retailers, service industries, and restaurants now found themselves struggling to survive. Housing markets plummeted as families were forced to leave in search of new jobs, and property values dropped in the wake of mass unemployment. What had once been thriving communities were now becoming ghost towns. Empty storefronts and abandoned homes were stark reminders of what had been lost, and the American dream seemed to be slipping further out of reach for many. For the workers who lost their jobs, the story was even more painful. The average American factory worker, who had once relied on a steady paycheck from companies like Ford and Tesla, was now left with little hope. The new jobs that were promised in these communities didn't materialize. The idea of retraining for a new career or moving to another part of the country to find work wasn't an option for many, particularly older workers who had spent decades in these factories. The promise of a secure, middle-class life that had once been a hallmark of the American industrial workforce was rapidly disappearing. And then, there were the consumers. As the cost of manufacturing in the U.S. skyrocketed due to tariffs, the price of new cars and trucks began to rise as well. Industry analysts predicted that the cost of an average U.S.-made car would increase by over $4,700, making it even more difficult for middle-class families to afford the vehicles that had once been a symbol of American prosperity. For many families, buying a new car, once an attainable goal, became nothing more than a distant dream. The rising prices of everyday goods added to the strain, leaving consumers with less disposable income and a diminished quality of life. Politicians quickly began to point fingers as frustration mounted across the country. Many accused Trump's tariffs of backfiring, leading to exactly the opposite of what they were intended to achieve. What was supposed to bring jobs back to the U.S. had instead forced companies to move to Canada. Ford and Tesla weren't the only ones. As the tariffs took their toll, a growing number of corporations across a range of industries began quietly shifting operations out of the U.S., taking advantage of lower production costs and friendlier trade policies in Canada. The shift was not just confined to the auto industry. Major corporations like Coca-Cola, Campbell Soup, and even Walmart, which had long operated in the U.S., began rerouting their supply chains to Canada. The reason for this migration was simple. It was cheaper to operate there. The U.S. tariffs on steel and aluminum, along with high energy costs, made it more expensive for companies to manufacture goods in the United States. By moving production to Canada, these companies could avoid these rising costs, protect their profits, and remain competitive in the global market. But this wasn't just a matter of companies seeking better deals, it was a reflection of a much deeper problem in the U.S. economy. As more companies left, the fabric of American industrial strength began to unravel. States that had once been at the heart of American manufacturing, like Michigan and Ohio, saw their economies shrink. Unemployment rose, and the once thriving industrial hubs became hollowed-out communities struggling to survive. Meanwhile, Canada was thriving. The very policies that were meant to protect American workers were now driving companies into the arms of Canada. The Canadian government's incentive packages were a key factor in this migration. Ford was offered a $590 million incentive to create 800 jobs in Ontario, while Tesla secured a $1.2 billion deal to set up its battery production in Quebec. These generous government incentives, combined with Canada's low energy costs and stable labor force, made it an increasingly attractive destination for companies seeking to avoid the rising costs in the U.S. The consequences of this shift were felt far beyond just the auto industry. As American factories closed their doors and companies moved their operations north, it became clear that the U.S. was losing its competitive edge. The idea of Made in America, once synonymous with pride and quality, was losing its value. The high costs of production in the U.S., coupled with the unpredictability of tariffs, made it harder for American manufacturers to compete globally. Companies like Ford and Tesla, once symbols of American strength, were now seeking stability and profit outside the country. In Canada, however, the situation was vastly different. While American companies struggled under the weight of tariffs and rising costs, Canada positioned itself as a friendly and stable place for business. The government's proactive stance in attracting foreign investment helped foster a manufacturing boom, as companies from across North America and beyond recognized the advantages of doing business in Canada. The economic growth in Ontario, Quebec, and other provinces was driven by the influx of manufacturing jobs that had once been staples in the U.S., but were now shifting north. The international implications of this shift were also significant. As Canada grew stronger economically, its role as a global player began to shift. What had once been seen as a smaller, more peripheral economy now began to assert itself on the world stage. The U.S., meanwhile, was facing increasing pressure from both domestic and international sources to rethink its protectionist policies. Countries around the world, particularly those in Europe and Asia, began to take note of the impact that tariffs and trade wars were having on the U.S. economy. Could they, too, create policies to protect their industries without resorting to the same protectionist tactics? As the U.S. economy continued to lose ground, many began to question the long-term viability of Trump's America First policies. The tariffs and protectionist strategies that had been designed to strengthen U.S. industry had instead driven companies away, leaving the U.S. in a position where it was no longer the dominant industrial power it once was. The question on everyone's mind was whether America could still claim its place as the world's industrial leader, or whether it had already ceded that title to countries like Canada. The question is clear. Can the U.S. still hold its place as an industrial leader in the world, or is it already sliding into the role of an outsider, relegated to the sidelines as global markets continue to evolve? This is the crossroads that America now faces. The choices made in Washington are no longer just domestic policy decisions. They have global repercussions. The future of American industry and its position in the world hangs in the balance, and the world is watching.